When cattle rancher Cole Bennett spent his last $23 to outbid a ruthless mine owner for two desperate women at an illegal auction behind Copper Falls' most notorious saloon, he had no idea he was about to ignite a war that would either destroy everything he'd worked for or save three broken souls from a fate worse than death. The autumn wind cut through Copper Falls like a rusty blade, carrying the scent of dying leaves and broken promises. Cole Bennett pulled his threadbare coat tighter as he guided his limping horse down Main Street, the animal's shoes clicking against cobblestones worn smooth by decades of miners' boots and merchant wagons. His stomach gnawed at itself. He hadn't eaten anything substantial in 2 days, surviving on bitter coffee and the kind of pride that kept a man upright when everything else wanted to drag him down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bank notice crumpled in his vest pocket felt heavier than the Winchester, rifle strapped to his back. 30 days. That's all the time he had left before Magnus Thornfield's mining operation would seize his family's ranch, the same land his grandfather had bled into and his father had died defending. Cole's cattle had succumbed to the harsh winter. His crops had failed when the mine's runoff poisoned his water supply, and now he was down to his last $23 and a prayer that wouldn't come. He remembered when this town had been different. Before Thornfield's Black Mountain Mining Company had descended like locusts, Copper Falls had been a place where honest men could make honest livings. Families had worked the land for generations, children had played in streets that weren't clouded with coal dust, and the river had run clear enough to drink from. Now the water tasted of metal and sorrow, the air hung thick with the smoke from Thornfield's smelting operations, and half the buildings stood empty because their owners had either sold out or been driven out. Cole's own story was written in the same bitter ink as dozens of others. His father, William Bennett, had built their ranch with his bare hands after returning from the war, clearing timber and hauling stones until he'd carved a life from the wilderness. Cole had grown up believing that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle, that a man's worth was measured in the sweat of his brow and the strength of his character. He'd married his childhood sweetheart, Sarah McKinnon, in the little church that Thornfield's men had burned down last spring, claiming it was blocking access to a new mine shaft. Sarah had died 3 winters ago when the fever swept through the valley, another casualty of the overcrowded conditions that came with Thornfield's expansion. The company had imported hundreds of workers, cramming them into hastily built shanties with no proper sanitation, and disease had spread like wildfire. Cole had held his wife's hand as she slipped away, her last words a whispered promise that they'd meet again in a better place. He'd buried her beneath the old oak tree on the hill behind their cabin, the same tree where they'd carved their initials as children. Since then, Cole had been fighting a losing battle against time, circumstance, and Magnus Thornfield's relentless appetite for expansion. Every month brought new challenges: contaminated wells, diseased livestock, mysterious fires that consumed his hay stores, and always the steady pressure of debt that grew faster than his ability to pay it down. He'd sold everything he could, spare, and worked himself to the bone. But it hadn't been enough. Nothing was ever enough when you were fighting a man with unlimited resources and no conscience. He'd ridden into town not for salvation, but for supplies. A bag of grain for his horse and maybe some jerky, if he could afford it. The general store's shelves looked as barren as his prospects, and old Henrik, the storekeeper's sympathetic nod, only twisted the knife deeper. Everyone in Copper Falls knew Cole Bennett was finished. Everyone except Cole himself, who still clung to the stubborn belief that a man could outwork his circumstances if he just refused to quit. "You sure you don't want to take Thornfield's offer?" Henrik had asked, as he weighed out the meager portion of grain Cole could afford. I heard he's still willing to hire you on as a foreman if you sign over the ranch peaceful-like. Better than losing everything and getting nothing in return." Cole had shaken his head, the same way he'd done every time someone suggested surrender. "That land's got my family's blood in it," he'd said. "My grandfather cleared those fields. My father built that cabin, and my wife's buried on that hill. I'd rather die fighting than live knowing I gave up." Henrik had sighed and shaken his head, the way old men do when they've seen too much of the world's cruelty to believe in noble gestures anymore. "Pride's a cold comfort when winter comes, son, and Thornfield's got a long memory for folks who cross him." The sun was setting behind the mountains when Cole heard the commotion. At first, he thought it might be another mining crew celebrating their latest strike, but the voices carried a different tone, hushed, urgent, tinged with something that made his skin crawl. He followed the sound around the corner of Murphy's saloon, past the rain barrels and broken wagon wheels, to where a crowd had gathered in the alley like vultures circling carrion. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his days. 2. Women stood on a makeshift platform of stacked crates, their hands bound with rough rope, their faces bearing the hollow look of people who had already died inside. The first was barely more than a girl, maybe 19, with auburn hair that caught the dying light and green eyes that stared straight ahead, as if she could will herself invisible. Her dress was simple but clean, the kind a farmer's daughter might wear to Sunday service, though it hung loose on her thin frame, as if she'd lost weight recently. There were bruises on her wrists where the ropes had chafed, and a small cut on her lower lip that suggested she'd tried to fight back at some point. The second woman was older, perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back severely, and skin that spoke of mixed heritage, maybe Mexican or native. Cole couldn't tell. She stood protectively in front of the younger woman, her jaw set in defiance, even as fear flickered in her brown eyes. Her dress was patched and travel-worn, but she wore it with a dignity that made Cole's chest tighten. Unlike her companion, she didn't try to hide from the crowd's stares. Instead, she met them head-on, her chin raised in silent challenge to anyone who dared to see her as less than human. Standing before them like a king, surveying his domain, was Magnus Thornfield himself, the mine owner whose operation had slowly strangled the life out of Copper Falls. Thornfield was a mountain of a man, 6.5 feet tall, with hands like sledgehammers and eyes the color of dirty ice. His black coat was tailored from expensive fabric that probably cost more than most families earned in a year, and gold chains draped across his vest like battle trophies. When he smiled, which he was doing now, it revealed teeth that had been capped with silver, a grotesque display of wealth in a town where most folks couldn't afford to fix a broken bone. Thornfield's presence dominated the alley the way a thundercloud dominates the sky before a storm. Men who normally stood tall seemed to shrink in his shadow, and even the boldest among them avoided making direct eye contact. Cole had only seen the mine owner up close a handful of times, usually when Thornfield was making one of his periodic tours of the territory he now controlled, but each encounter had left him with the same impression. This was a man who viewed other people as resources to be exploited, obstacles to be removed, or entertainment to be consumed. "Gentlemen," Thornfield's voice boomed over the crowd, carrying the polished accent of someone who'd been educated back east but had chosen to make his fortune in the wild territories where law was negotiable and conscience was a luxury few could afford. "I present to you 2 prime specimens of frontier womanhood, both young, both healthy, both in need of proper guidance from a man with the means to provide it." He gestured toward the women like a carnival barker displaying exotic animals, his rings catching the lamplight as his hands moved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The younger one's got breeding hips and a quiet disposition, perfect for bearing sons. The older one's got fire in her belly and experience with hard work. Either would make a fine addition to the right household. Cole felt bile rise in his throat. He'd heard rumors of such auctions, whispered stories from travelers and drifters about towns where desperate people were bought and sold like livestock. But seeing it with his own eyes was like taking a punch to the gut. Around him, men shuffled, their feet and avoided eye contact, their shame palpable but not strong enough to overcome their fear of Thornfield's retribution. These were his neighbors, people he'd known his entire life, and they were standing here watching two women be degraded and humiliated without lifting a finger to stop it. Among the crowd, Cole recognized faces that made his stomach turn. There was Dr. Morrison, who'd sworn an oath to do no harm, but was apparently willing to look the other way when harm was being done to others. Sheriff Garrett stood near the back, his badge catching the light as he studied his boots with sudden fascination, clearly having decided that whatever was happening here wasn't technically in his jurisdiction. Even Pastor Williams was present, though he'd pulled his hat low and wrapped his scarf high, as if anonymity could absolve him of witnessing this travesty. A thin man in a banker's suit raised his hand. Cole recognized him as Timothy Fletcher, who worked for the territorial bank that held the mortgages on half the businesses in town. "What's the starting bid, Mr. Thornfield?" $50 each, Thornfield announced, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing the price of livestock at a county fair. "But I'm feeling generous tonight. Take both for 90, and I'll throw in transportation to wherever you call home." The younger woman's composure finally cracked, and a single tear traced down her cheek, leaving a clean track through the dust that had accumulated on her face during whatever ordeal had brought her to this moment. The older woman shifted slightly, trying to shield her companion from the crowd's hungry stares, and Cole noticed the way her bound hands trembled, not from fear but from barely contained rage. There was something in her posture that reminded him of a caged wildcat, dangerous and unpredictable, held in check only by the certain knowledge that any move she made would bring swift and brutal retaliation. "I'll take the dark-haired one," hauled out a voice from the back. Cole turned to see Thomas Hartley, a prospector who'd struck silver the previous spring and had been spending his newfound wealth on liquor and gambling ever since. Hartley was a man who'd never worked an honest day in his life before stumbling onto his claim, and his sudden prosperity had only amplified his worst qualities. $60, and she can work my claim until she earns her keep. 70 for the young one, countered another man, this one wearing the leather apron of a blacksmith. Cole knew him as Marcus Webb, a widower whose wife had died in childbirth 2 years earlier, leaving him with 3 young children and no one to care for them. Webb wasn't a bad man under normal circumstances, but desperation had a way of eroding even good men's moral foundations. "My wife died last winter, and I need someone to tend the house and mind my children." Thornfield's smile widened, revealing more of those gleaming silver teeth. "Now we're getting somewhere. Do I hear 80? The bidding continued, each offer more callous than the last. Men discussed the women's potential uses as casually as they might debate the merits of different plow horses, reducing human beings to their basic utility as workers, breeders, or objects of gratification. Cole listened to neighbors and acquaintances, reveal the depths of their degradation, and with each bid, something fundamental shifted inside his chest. Cole's hands clenched into fists as memories flooded back unbidden. He remembered his mother, Martha Bennett, who died trying to birth his stillborn sister while his father was away selling cattle in Denver. She'd been alone when the complications started, with only old Mrs. Patterson to help, and by the time his father returned, it was too late to save either mother or child. His father had never forgiven himself for not being there, and Cole had grown up understanding that protecting women and children wasn't just a moral obligation. It was the defining characteristic that separated men from beasts, he thought. Of his late wife Sarah, who'd been just 18 when they married, full of dreams about the family they'd build together and the life they'd create on the ranch. She'd talked constantly about the children they'd have, the garden she'd plant, the improvements they'd make to the cabin as their family grew. The fever that took her had stolen not just her life, but the future they'd planned together, leaving Cole with nothing but memories and the bitter knowledge that sometimes the world took away everything you loved without offering any explanation or hope of redemption. Maybe it was the memory of his mother's final moments, or the ghost of his wife's unfulfilled dreams, or simply the bone-deep certainty that some lines couldn't be crossed, some evils couldn't be ignored, even when fighting them meant destroying yourself in the process. But as he watched the older woman whisper something to her companion, something that made the girl's chin lift with borrowed courage despite the tears still streaming down her face, Cole Bennett felt something snap inside his chest. Tut! Rational part of his mind screamed warnings about the futility of what he was contemplating. He had nothing, less than nothing. $23 wouldn't save anyone, least of all himself. He was already facing financial ruin and would likely be dead within a year regardless of what he did tonight. Getting involved would only accelerate his destruction while probably failing to help these women in any meaningful way. Thornfield was too powerful, too well-connected, too ruthless to be defeated by a single broken-down rancher with more pride than sense. But sometimes rationality was the enemy of righteousness, and Cole had been raised to believe that a man's worth wasn't measured by his possessions or his prospects, but by his willingness to stand up for what was right when it mattered most. His grandfather had charged up Cemetery Ridge at Gettysburg, knowing he'd probably die, but unwilling to let his comrades face that hell alone. His father had stood against claim jumpers and cattle thieves even when outnumbered, because some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. $100, Cole called out, his voice cutting through the crowd like a blade through silk. The effect was immediate and electric. Every head turned toward him, conversations died mid-sentence, and for a moment the only sound in the alley was the distant howling of wind through the mountain passes. Thornfield's eyes narrowed as he took in Cole's worn clothes and hollow cheeks, clearly calculating whether this scarecrow of a man could possibly have that kind of money. The crowd murmured among themselves. Everyone knew Cole Bennett was finished, his ranch mortgaged to the hilt, and his livestock dead or dying, so where would he get $100? Several men near the front actually laughed, harsh sounds that echoed off the alley walls. "That's rich," one of them said. "Bennett can't even afford to feed his horse, let alone bid on women." "Probably doesn't have $10 to his name," added another. But Thornfield held up a hand for silence, his predatory instincts telling him there was more to this than met the eye. "Cash only," he said finally, his voice dripping with skepticism but tinged with the careful attention of a man who'd built his fortune by never underestimating an opponent. Cole reached into his vest with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what he was about to do. He pulled out the bank notice, unfolding it slowly to reveal the small leather pouch attached to the back, his last $23 in silver coins, along with his grandfather's pocket watch and his mother's wedding ring. Together, they represented everything of value he had left in the world, the final remnants of a family legacy that stretched back 3 generations. The pocket watch had belonged to his grandfather, William Bennett Sr., who'd carried it through the entire Civil War from First Bull Run to Appomattox Courthouse. The old man had told stories about checking that watch before charges, timing artillery barrages, and counting the minutes until relief arrived during siege situations. It was solid gold with intricate engravings that depicted scenes from American history, and its crystal face had somehow survived 4 years of warfare without a single crack. Cole's grandfather had passed it down to his father, who'd carried it during his own battles against hostile tribes and claim jumpers, and it had been destined to go to Cole's own son someday, the son who would now never be born. The wedding ring had been his mother's most prized possession, a simple band set with modest but genuine diamonds that his father had saved for months to buy. Martha Bennett had worn it every day for 30 years, polishing it each morning until it gleamed, and she'd made Cole promise to give it to his own bride when the time came. He'd fulfilled that promise when he married Sarah, but after her death, he'd taken to carrying it as a reminder of the love they'd shared and the life they'd planned together. "I'll give you what I have now," Cole said, stepping forward through the crowd, which parted before him like water before a ship's prow. $23 cash, plus this watch and ring. The watch is solid gold, belonged to my grandfather, who fought at Bull Run and Gettysburg. The ring's got real diamonds. My mother wore it for 30 years before she passed. He held up the items, letting them catch the lamplight that spilled from Murphy's saloon. Several men in the crowd whistled softly at the sight of the watch's intricate engraving and the ring's modest but genuine stones. Even in a town where most people struggled to make ends meet, quality was recognizable, and these pieces clearly represented craftsmanship and materials that were worth significant money to the right buyer. Thornfield studied Cole with the cold intensity of a snake eyeing a mouse, his calculating gaze taking in every detail, from Cole's worn boots to his threadbare coat, to the desperate determination in his eyes. "You're that rancher, aren't you? The one who's been causing trouble about my water rights?" "I'm the one whose land you've been trying to steal," Cole replied evenly, meeting Thornfield's stare without flinching. "But that's between you and me. These women have nothing to do with our business." "Oh, but they do," Thornfield said, his smile turning predatory as he sensed an opportunity to inflict maximum damage on an enemy who dared to defy him. "You see, Mr. Bennett, these particular ladies were caught trespassing on my property. Seems they were hiding in one of my abandoned mine shafts, probably planning to steal whatever they could carry. Makes them my responsibility to dispose of as I see fit." The older woman's head snapped up at this obvious lie, her eyes blazing with fury, but the gag around her mouth prevented her from speaking. Cole saw the truth in her expression. Whatever had brought these women to Copper Falls, it wasn't theft. They were running from something, seeking shelter, probably hoping to disappear into the wilderness beyond the mining camps. But Thornfield's men had found them first, and now they were being sold like cattle to pay for crimes they'd never committed. "Even so," Cole said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest, "I'm offering fair payment for their freedom. That watch alone is worth $60 to the right collector." Thornfield walked closer, his massive frame casting a shadow over Cole like a storm cloud blocking out the sun. Up close, the mine owner was even more intimidating. His shoulders were broad enough to fill a doorway, his hands looked capable of crushing stones, and his eyes held the flat, emotionless quality of a man who'd done terrible things so often that they no longer registered as significant. "Tell you what, Bennett, I'll take your offer, but I want something else thrown in." "What? When you lose that ranch of yours, and we both know you will, I want you to work in my mines for 1 full year to pay off their purchase price. Consider it insurance against any future attempts to interfere with my business operations." The crowd fell silent as the implications of Thornfield's proposal sank in. Everyone knew that men who went to work in Magnus Thornfield's mines had a habit of disappearing, victims of cave-ins and accidents that seemed to happen with suspicious regularity to anyone who'd previously opposed the mining company's interests. It was a death sentence delivered with a smile, a guarantee that Cole Bennett would spend his final months laboring in darkness before meeting an appropriately dramatic end. But Cole looked at the two women, saw the way they watched him with a mixture of hope and terror, and realized that some choices weren't really choices at all. They were tests of what kind of man you decided to be when everything else was stripped away, when all the comfortable justifications and rational excuses fell aside to reveal the fundamental core of your character. He could walk away right now, preserve what little he had left, and spend his remaining time fighting a doomed battle to save his ranch. Or he could step forward into certain destruction and give two strangers a chance at something better than the fate that awaited them. "Deal," he said, extending his hand toward the man who would almost certainly be his executioner. Thornfield's grip was like being caught in a bear trap, all crushing pressure and sharp edges. But Cole didn't flinch or try to pull away. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, their appetite for entertainment soured by the sudden turn toward real consequence and genuine sacrifice. Money and jewelry changed hands with business-like efficiency, Thornfield's men handling the transaction with the smooth professionalism of people who'd done this many times before. Within minutes, Cole found himself standing beside two women whose names he didn't even know, watching Magnus Thornfield disappear into the gathering darkness with everything Cole had left in the world clutched in his massive fists. The mine owner's laughter echoed off the alley walls as he walked away, a sound like grinding millstones that promised future pain and suffering. The older woman was the first to speak once her bonds were cut by one of the dispersing crowd members, who'd apparently grown disgusted with the entire proceedings. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met," she said, her voice hoarse but steady, "or the most foolish." "Probably both," Cole admitted, rubbing feeling back into his empty hands while trying to process the magnitude of what he'd just done. In the space of 5 minutes, he'd spent his last dollar, signed his own death warrant, and taken responsibility for two complete strangers whose problems he didn't understand and couldn't solve. "I'm Cole Bennett, Rosa Delgado," she replied, then gestured toward her companion who was still wiping tears from her cheeks. "This is Emma Patterson, and before you ask what we were doing in that mine shaft, you should know we weren't stealing anything, we were hiding." "From what?" Rosa and Emma exchanged a look that spoke of shared trauma and desperate decisions, the kind of wordless communication that develops between people who've survived terrible experiences together. "From men who bought us in Santa Fe," Emma said, quietly speaking for the first time since Cole had heard her voice. Her words carried the flat, emotionless tone of someone recounting facts too painful for proper feeling. "Men who planned to use us in ways we couldn't accept." Cole felt his stomach turn as the full scope of their situation became clear. These weren't criminals or opportunists. They were victims who'd escaped from one form of slavery only to be captured and sold into another. "You escaped." 3 days ago, Rosa confirmed, her eyes scanning the now empty alley as if expecting their original captors to emerge from the shadows at any moment. "We've been traveling at night, hiding during the day, living on berries and stream water. When we saw that abandoned mine, we thought we'd be safe until we could figure out our next move. Instead, Thornfield's men found us this morning." The three of them stood in the empty alley as full darkness settled over Copper Falls like a burial shroud. Cole's horse nickered softly from where he'd tied it to a hitching post, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled its loneliness to the stars that were beginning to appear in the clear mountain sky. Cole realized he had no plan beyond the moment when he'd opened his mouth and changed all their lives forever. "I have a ranch," he said finally, the words feeling strange in his mouth because he wasn't sure how much longer that would be true. "About 10 miles north of here. It's not much, just a cabin and some fenced pasture, but it's shelter." "What's the catch?" Rosa asked, her eyes still wary despite the gratitude he could see fighting to emerge. "Men don't spend their last dollar on strangers without expecting something in return." Cole met her gaze steadily, appreciating her directness even as it forced him to confront the brutal honesty of their situation. The catch is that come next month, the bank's gonna take it all anyway. And after that, I'll be working in Thornfield's mines until I'm dead or too broken to swing a pickaxe. So if you're looking for a hero who can solve all your problems, you've got the wrong man. Emma stepped forward, her green eyes bright with unshed tears that reflected the lamplight like scattered jewels. "Thank you," she said simply, the words carrying more weight than elaborate speeches or flowery gratitudes. "Whatever happens next, thank you for giving us a choice." As they walked toward his horse, Cole wondered if he'd just saved 2 lives, or simply delayed the inevitable for all 3 of them. The rational part of his mind was already cataloguing the problems they'd face: limited food, no money, winter coming, and Thornfield's certain retaliation when he realized Cole couldn't be easily disposed of. But for the first time in months, the weight in his chest felt different, not lighter, but somehow more bearable, as if sharing the burden had made it less crushing. He'd spent his last dollar and signed his own death warrant, but he'd also remembered what it felt like to be the kind of man his father had raised him to be. The road ahead stretched into darkness, leading toward an uncertain future that none of them could predict or control. But as Rosa helped Emma up onto the horse while Cole walked alongside holding the reins, he realized that sometimes the only way forward was together, even when you couldn't see where you were going, even when you knew the destination was likely to be your grave. Behind them, Copper Falls settled into its usual restless sleep, a town slowly dying under the weight of one man's greed and ambition. Ahead lay the wilderness, 10 miles of rough country that would test them all before they reached whatever sanctuary Cole's failing ranch might provide. And somewhere in the darkness, Magnus Thornfield was probably already planning his revenge against the man who dared to interfere with his business one final time. But for now, in this moment, 3 broken souls walked together toward an uncertain dawn, bound by nothing more than shared desperation and the fragile hope that sometimes, when everything else failed, simple human decency could still light the way forward. Tishat, 10-mile journey to Cole's ranch stretched before them like a gauntlet of shadows and uncertainty. The moon hung thin and cold above the mountain peaks, providing just enough light to navigate the winding trail that snaked through pine forests and rocky outcroppings. Cole walked beside his horse, one hand resting on the animal's neck, while Rosa and Emma rode together in uncomfortable silence. The only sounds were the steady clip-clop of hooves on packed earth, the whisper of wind through evergreen branches, and the distant call of night birds that seemed to mock their desperate flight from civilization. Emma sat rigidly upright, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white in the moonlight. Every few minutes she would glance back toward Copper Falls, as if expecting to see torches pursuing them through the darkness. Rosa positioned herself protectively behind the younger woman, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line for signs of movement, her body language radiating the kind of vigilant tension that comes from too many nights spent running from predators, both human and animal. Cole found himself stealing glances at his unexpected companions, trying to piece together their story from the fragments they'd revealed. Rosa carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to hardship but not broken by it. There was steel in her spine and fire in her eyes that spoke of battles fought and survived. Emma, on the other hand, seemed more fragile, like a flower that had been trampled but was still trying to reach toward the sun. Both women bore the unmistakable marks of people who'd seen too much of the world's cruelty too young. "How long have you two been traveling together?" Cole asked quietly, hoping to break the oppressive silence that had settled over their small procession. Rosa answered without taking her eyes off the surrounding forest. 6 months. We met in Santa Fe when—" She paused, seeming to weigh how much to reveal, when we found ourselves in similar circumstances. Similar circumstances was clearly a euphemism for something much darker, but Cole didn't press for details. He'd seen enough suffering in his 32 years to recognize when people needed to share their stories in their own time and their own way. Instead, he focused on the practical concerns that were already beginning to mount in his mind, like storm clouds on the horizon. His ranch had enough food for one man to last maybe 2 weeks if he stretched it carefully. 3 people would exhaust his supplies in less than a week, and winter was coming fast. The cabin had only 1 bed and a small loft that barely qualified as a second room. There was no privacy, no comfort, and precious little hope of improvement. Given his financial situation, he was bringing these women to a place that offered shelter but little else, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd rescued them from one form of suffering only to introduce them to another. As they crested a small hill, Emma suddenly stiffened and pointed toward a cluster of lights moving through the valley below. "Riders," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Cole immediately led the horse off the main trail, guiding them into a grove of aspen trees whose pale trunks would provide some camouflage in the moonlight. They waited in tense silence as the lights drew closer, and Cole could make out the shapes of at least 4 mounted men moving at a steady pace along the road they'd just abandoned. The riders weren't hurrying, but they weren't dawdling either. They had the purposeful movement of people following a specific trail. "Thornfield's men?" Rosa asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "Probably," Cole replied, watching the lights disappear around a bend. He doesn't like loose ends, and he especially doesn't like people who make him look weak in front of a crowd. They waited another 10 minutes before returning to the trail, but the encounter had changed the dynamic between them. The abstract danger of their situation had suddenly become concrete and immediate. Thornfield wasn't going to simply let them disappear into the wilderness. He was actively hunting them, and his resources far exceeded anything Cole could muster in response. "Why did you really do it?" Emma asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the night air like a blade. "Back there, I mean. You don't know us. You don't owe us anything, and you gave up everything you had left." Cole considered the question as they continued walking, trying to find words for feelings that ran deeper than rational explanation. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said finally. "Sarah. She was everything good in my life. When she passed, I thought about giving up, letting Thornfield have the ranch and just disappearing into the mountains to drink myself to death." He paused to help the horse navigate a particularly rocky section of trail before continuing. "But Sarah used to say that we don't get to choose what happens to us, only how we respond to it. She believed that every person has moments when they can either become better or become worse, and those moments define who we really are." Rosa shifted in the saddle, her voice carrying a note of skepticism. "And you think tonight was one of those moments?" "I think tonight I had a choice between walking away and living with knowing I could have helped but didn't, or stepping forward and living with whatever consequences came from trying to do the right thing." Cole looked up at the stars, scattered across the sky like scattered diamonds. Sarah would have stepped forward. Hell, she probably would have bid everything we owned, and then some if she'd been in my place. Emma was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." She was. And maybe she'd have liked knowing that her memory helped me remember who I was supposed to be. The conversation lapsed back into comfortable silence, but something had shifted between them. The awkward formality of strangers had begun to evolve into something more genuine, a tentative connection forged by shared danger and mutual vulnerability. They were no longer just a failed rancher and 2 escaped victims. They were 3, people who'd found themselves bound together by circumstances beyond their control, trying to make the best of an impossible situation. As they descended into a narrow valley crossed by a fast-moving stream, Cole noticed that his horse was beginning to favor its left front leg. The animal had been limping slightly when they left. A town, but the additional weight and the rough terrain were clearly aggravating whatever injury it had sustained. They couldn't afford to have the horse go lame. It was their only means of transportation and their most valuable remaining asset. "We need to rest," Cole announced, leading them to a sheltered spot near the stream where a cluster of boulders would provide some protection from the wind. "The horse needs water, and we could all use a few minutes to catch our breath." As Rosa and Emma dismounted, Cole examined the horse's leg by moonlight. The animal had picked up a stone in its shoe, wedged deep enough to cause pain, but not deep. Enough to cause permanent damage if removed carefully. Cole pulled out his knife and began working at the stone, talking quietly to the horse to keep it calm. "You know about horses," Rosa observed, settling onto a fallen log with obvious relief. "My father taught me. Said a man who couldn't care for his animals wasn't much of a man at all." Cole successfully extracted the stone and patted the horse's neck. "Course, he also said a man who couldn't pay his debts wasn't much of a man either. So I'm not exactly living up to his standards these days." Emma knelt by the stream and cupped water in her hands, drinking deeply before splashing some on her face. "What was your father like?" she asked. "Stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery." Cole replied with a sad smile, but honest to his core. "He built our ranch from nothing after the war, and he always said that hard work and fair dealing would see a man through any trouble. Took Thornfield's operation to prove him wrong about that." Rosa stood and walked to the edge of their makeshift camp, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the stream. "My father was a trader," she said quietly. "He used to travel between the Mexican settlements and the American towns, buying and selling goods, trying to build a better life for our family. One day he crossed the wrong people, and they killed him for his wagon and horses." "I'm sorry," Cole said, and meant it. "That was 10 years ago. I learned that day that the world doesn't care about your plans or your dreams. It only cares about whether you're strong enough to survive what it throws at you." She turned back toward them, her face hard in the moonlight. "I've been surviving ever since." Emma wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the relatively mild night air. "My father was a preacher," she said in a voice so quiet they had to strain to hear her. "He used to say that God had a plan for everyone, that suffering was just a test of faith. When my mother died giving birth to my brother, he said it was God's will. When my brother died of the fever 2 years later, he said that too was God's will." Her voice broke slightly before she continued. "When those men came to our town and took me, my father said maybe it was God's way of teaching me humility. I haven't spoken to God since." The silence that followed was heavy with shared pain and understanding. 3 people from different backgrounds and different circumstances, but all marked by loss and betrayal, all struggling to find meaning in a world that seemed determined to crush anyone who dared to hope for something better. Cole stood and gathered some dry wood from the edge of the clearing. "We should risk a small fire," he said. "Get some warmth and maybe heat some water for coffee. We're far enough from the main road that the light shouldn't give us away." As he worked to build the fire, Rosa and Emma moved closer together, their earlier wariness giving way to a kind of tentative friendship born from mutual recognition of shared experience. Emma was still clearly traumatized and fragile, but Rosa's protective presence seemed to give her strength, while Rosa herself appeared to find purpose in caring for someone more vulnerable than herself. "How long do you think we have?" Rosa asked, as Cole coaxed flames from the kindling. "Before they find us, I mean." "Depends on how badly Thornfield wants to make an example of me," Cole replied honestly. "Could be days, could be weeks, but they will find us eventually. His operation covers most of this territory, and he's got more men than I can fight." Emma stared into the growing flames, her green eyes reflecting the dancing light. "So what do we do?" It was a simple question with no simple answer. Cole had been trying to avoid thinking about their long-term prospects because every scenario he could imagine ended badly for all of them. They had no money, no supplies, no allies, and winter was approaching fast. Even if they could somehow evade Thornfield's men indefinitely, they'd still have to face the practical challenges of survival in a hostile environment with limited resources. "We take it one day at a time," Cole said finally. "We get to the ranch, we rest, we figure out what supplies we have and what we need. Maybe we can make it through the winter if we're careful. Come spring, maybe the situation will look different." Rosa's expression suggested she found his optimism unconvincing, but she didn't voice her skepticism. Instead, she asked, "What's your ranch like?" Cole poured water from his canteen into a small pot and set it near the fire to heat. "It's not much. One-room cabin with a loft. A barn that's mostly fallen down. About 40 acres of pasture that used to support cattle. There's a good well and a vegetable garden that might still have some potatoes and carrots if the deer haven't gotten to them." He pulled a small bag of coffee from his saddlebags and measured out a careful portion. "The cabin's solid. My father built it to last. Good stone chimney, thick walls, roof that doesn't leak too much. It's not comfortable, but it's dry and warm." "Sounds like paradise compared to some places I've been," Emma said softly, as the coffee brewed, filling the air with its rich aroma. Cole found himself studying his companions in the firelight. Rosa had the kind of beauty that came from strength, rather than delicacy. High cheekbones, dark eyes that missed nothing, and hands that showed the calluses of hard work. Emma was lovely in a more traditional sense, with features that belonged on a church painting, but there was a fragility about her that made Cole want to shield her from further harm. Both women had clearly endured experiences that would have broken weaker people, and both were still fighting to survive, despite having every reason to give up hope. There was something inspiring about their resilience, something that reminded Cole of what his wife had always seen in people, the capacity for courage in the face of impossible odds. "Can I ask what happened to you?" Cole said carefully. "I mean how you ended up in Santa Fe in the first place." Rosa and Emma exchanged another look, and Cole could see them weighing how much trust to extend to this stranger who'd risked everything for them. Finally, Rosa spoke. "Emma's father sold her to pay his debts," she said bluntly. "Told her it was temporary, that he'd buy her back when his circumstances improved. The men who bought her had different plans." Cole felt his jaw clench. "And you?" "I was working in a cantina in El Paso when some men decided I was part of what they were buying along with their drinks. When I fought back, they claimed I'd stolen from them and had me arrested. The sheriff was in their pocket, so I got sold to pay my debt to society." Emma stared into the fire, her voice distant. "We were being transported north to a mining camp where we were supposed to work for men who hadn't seen women in months. Rosa picked the lock on our chains during a river crossing. We've been running ever since." The simple recitation of facts carried more horror than any dramatic retelling could have conveyed. These women hadn't chosen their circumstances. They'd been victimized by a system that treated them as property rather than people, and their only crime had been trying to reclaim their freedom and dignity. Cole poured coffee into 3 tin cups and passed them around, grateful for the small ritual that gave him time to process what he'd heard. "You won't be sold again," he said quietly. "Not while I'm alive to prevent it." Rosa studied him over the rim of her cup. "That's a dangerous promise to make to people you barely know." "Maybe, but it's the only promise that matters right now." They finished their coffee in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the uncertain future that awaited them. The fire burned down to glowing coals, and the night sounds of the forest seemed to grow louder. Owls calling from the treetops, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, the distant howl of coyotes that reminded them they weren't the only predators moving through the darkness. As they prepared to continue their journey, Cole couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something larger and more dangerous than any of them fully understood. Thornfields. Reach extended far beyond the boundaries of his mining operations, and his appetite for revenge was legendary throughout the territory. By challenging him publicly, Cole had committed them all to a path that could only end in violence. But as he helped Rosa and Emma back onto the horse and began walking toward his ranch again, Cole realized that for the first time in months, he felt like he had a purpose beyond simple survival. These women needed protection, and providing it gave meaning to his remaining days, whether they numbered in weeks or years. Sarah would have understood that, would have approved of the choice he'd made, even if she might have questioned his methods. That road ahead wound through increasingly familiar territory as they approached the land Cole had called home for his entire adult life. Soon they would reach the ranch that represented everything he'd built and everything he was about to lose. But for now, in this moment, he was exactly where he needed to be, walking through the darkness toward an uncertain dawn, accompanied by two people who'd reminded him that sometimes the most important battles were fought not for victory, but simply because they were worth fighting. Behind them, the lights of Copper Falls had long since disappeared, swallowed by distance and the rolling contours of the mountain landscape. Ahead lay whatever sanctuary Cole's failing ranch might provide, and beyond that, a future none of them could predict or control. But they were moving forward together, and sometimes that was enough. Dawn broke over the Bennett ranch like a watercolor, painting soft blues and golds, bleeding across the sky as morning mist rose from the valley floor. Cole's cabin sat nestled against a hillside of pine and aspen, its weathered log walls and stone chimney speaking of solid construction and years of patient maintenance. The structure looked smaller than Cole remembered, more vulnerable somehow, as if seeing it through the eyes of his guests had revealed its limitations in ways he'd never noticed before. Rosa was the first to dismount as they approached the front porch, her movements careful and deliberate as she helped Emma down from the horse. Both women stood quietly taking in their surroundings, the overgrown vegetable garden, the sagging barn with its partially collapsed roof, the pasture where fence posts stood like broken teeth marking boundaries that no longer mattered. It was clearly the home of a man who'd been fighting a losing battle against time and circumstance. "It's peaceful," Emma said finally, and Cole could hear the surprise in her voice, as if she'd expected something more desperate and threatening. "It is that," Cole agreed, leading his horse toward the barn. "Nearest neighbor is 5 miles east, and they mind their own business. Used to be we had cattle scattered across these hills, but—" He gestured toward the empty pastures with a shrug that carried years of accumulated disappointment. The barn's interior was darker and more cluttered than the outside suggested. Tools hung from wooden pegs driven into the support beams, their handles polished smooth by decades of use. Sacks of grain sat stacked in one corner, though not as many as there should have been this close to winter. A collection of horseshoes hung from nails near the door, and the air smelled of hay, leather, and the particular mustiness that accumulates in any building that's seen better days. Cole unsaddled his horse and began rubbing the animal down with handfuls of straw. His movements, automatic after years of routine. "There's feed in those sacks," he said without looking up. "Not much, but enough to keep him healthy for a while." Rosa explored the barn while Emma stayed near the doorway, clearly still uncomfortable in enclosed spaces. "You built all this yourself?" Rosa asked, running her hand along a workbench that showed signs of careful craftsmanship. "My father started it. I finished what he began and added the rest over the years." Cole filled a water trough from a bucket that caught runoff from the roof. "Every board and nail represents time I'll never get back. But I suppose that's true. of most things worth doing. They walked to the cabin together, Cole carrying their few possessions in his saddlebags, while Rosa and Emma followed with the cautious steps of people entering unknown territory. The front door opened with a creak that spoke of hinges in need of oil, revealing an interior that was Spartanly furnished, but scrupulously clean. The main room served multiple functions: kitchen, dining room, and sitting area all combined into a space dominated by a massive stone fireplace that Cole's father had built with rocks hauled down from the mountain slopes. A simple wooden table sat beneath the single window, flanked by 2 chairs that had been crafted from local timber. Shelves lined one wall, holding an assortment of books, tools, and the kinds of accumulated possessions that marked a place as someone's actual home rather than mere shelter. A ladder led to a small loft that served as Cole's bedroom, while a narrow door opened onto what had been intended as a nursery but now served as storage space. The kitchen area consisted of a wood-burning stove, a sink with a hand pump that drew water from the well, and cabinets that held dishes, cookware, and a modest supply of preserved foods. "It's not much," Cole said, suddenly aware of how humble his home must appear to women who'd seen bigger towns and fancier establishments. "But the roof doesn't leak, the stove draws properly, and the walls are thick enough to keep out the worst of the winter cold." Emma moved to the window and looked out at the view of rolling hills and distant mountains. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I grew up in a house with 7 other people. I've never had this much space to myself." Rosa was examining the books on the shelves, her finger tracing the spines of volumes that ranged from agricultural texts to classic literature. "You read Shakespeare?" she asked with surprise. "My wife did. Sarah was educated back east before her family moved out here. She used to read to me in the evenings, especially during the long winters." Cole opened the cabinets and began taking inventory of their food supplies. "Figured I should learn to appreciate the things she loved." The assessment of their resources was sobering. Cole had perhaps a week's worth of flour, beans, and preserved meat if they ate carefully. The vegetable garden might yield enough potatoes and carrots to extend that by a few days, but winter was approaching fast, and there was no money to buy additional supplies. They would need to hunt, forage, and hope that Cole's modest savings of preserved foods would see them through until spring. "We'll need to be careful with what we have," Cole said, trying to keep the worry out of his voice. "But we won't starve. There's game in these hills, and I know where to find edible plants and roots. It won't be comfortable, but we'll survive." Rosa joined him at the cabinet, her practical nature asserting itself as she began organizing what supplies they had. "I can stretch food further than you might think," she said, "and I know how to preserve meat and vegetables if we can get our hands-on more." Emma had settled into one of the chairs by the window, her posture suggesting exhaustion that went deeper than mere physical fatigue. "I can sew," she offered quietly, "and I know how to tend gardens if there's anything left to save." Cole looked at his unexpected guests and realized that despite their desperate circumstances, they were already beginning to function as a unit. Rosa's competence and determination complemented Emma's gentler skills, while his own knowledge of the land and local conditions provided the foundation they'd need to survive. It wasn't exactly a family, but it was something more cohesive than 3 strangers thrown together by chance. "First things first," Cole said, making a decision that surprised even him. "You both need proper rest. Rosa, you can have the main bed. Emma, the loft has a cot that should be comfortable enough. I'll make do with blankets by the fire." Rosa opened her mouth to protest, but Cole held up a hand. "You've been running for days, hiding in mine shafts and sleeping on the ground. You need real rest if you're going to have the strength for whatever comes next." Over the next several hours, they established routines and boundaries that began to transform the cabin from Cole's solitary refuge into something approaching a shared home. Rosa proved to be remarkably organized, rearranging their limited supplies with an efficiency that suggested extensive experience in making the best of difficult situations. Emma, once she'd rested and felt safer, revealed a talent for domestic tasks that made their humble quarters feel more welcoming. Cole found himself adjusting to the presence of other people in ways he hadn't expected. For 3 years, he'd lived alone with his memories and his failing ranch, speaking mostly to his horse and the occasional passing traveler. Now the cabin was filled with voices, with the sounds of other people moving around, with conversations that ranged from practical discussions about resource management to tentative explorations of shared experiences and mutual interests. "You mentioned you could hunt," Rosa said as they shared a modest lunch of beans and cornbread. "What kind of game?" "Deer, mostly. Some elk if we're lucky, rabbits and birds if we're not. There's a salt lick about 2 miles north where the deer come. To drink at dawn and dusk." Cole gestured toward the rifle hanging over the fireplace. "That Winchester's been in my family for 20 years. She's not pretty, but she's accurate." Emma looked up from the sock she was mending. "I've never eaten deer before." "It's good meat if you prepare it right," Rosa assured her. "Leaner than beef, but it fills you up and keeps you strong." She turned to Cole. "When do you usually hunt?" "Early morning or just before sunset. Deer are creatures of habit. They follow the same trails to the same watering spots at the same times every day. Patient man with a good rifle can feed his family pretty regularly if he knows where to look." The word family hung in the air between them, none of them quite ready to examine what it might mean in their current situation. They weren't related by blood or marriage, hadn't chosen each other under normal circumstances, and had no legal or social bonds to hold them together. But they were sharing resources, making plans together, and beginning to care about each other's welfare in ways that felt surprisingly natural. As the afternoon wore on, Emma ventured outside to examine the remains of the vegetable garden, while Rosa helped Cole inventory their tools and equipment. The garden had suffered from neglect, but Emma's experienced eye could identify potato hills that might still contain edible tubers and carrot rows where the roots had been protected by their own green tops. "There's enough here for maybe a dozen meals if we're careful," Emma reported when she returned, "and if we can find seeds, we could start a proper garden come spring." "Assuming we're still here come spring," Rosa said quietly. It was the first direct acknowledgement of the uncertainty that hung over all their plans. Cole had been trying to focus on immediate survival needs, but the larger questions couldn't be avoided indefinitely. Where would they be in 6 months? Would Thornfield's men find them before winter set in? Could they actually survive on their limited resources until spring brought new possibilities? "We'll be here," Cole said, with more confidence than he felt. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather cleared these fields. My father built this cabin, and my wife's buried on that hill. Thornfield can have the deed to the property, but he can't have what it means." Emma looked up from her sewing, her green eyes reflecting something that might have been hope. "You really think we can make it work?" "I think we don't have much choice. But to try," Cole replied honestly. "And I think 3 people working together have a better chance than any of us would have alone." Rosa stood and walked to the window, her gaze scanning the tree line as if expecting to see riders emerging from the forest. "Thornfield won't give up easily. Men like him don't forget insults, and they especially don't forget public humiliation." "No, they don't," Cole agreed, "but this ranch is defensible if it comes to that. Good sight lines, only one real approach road, and plenty of cover if we need to disappear into the hills. My father held off claim jumpers here more than once." Emma set down her sewing and joined them at the window. "What kind of man is Thornfield? I mean, what drives him?" Cole considered the question, trying to put into words his understanding of a man he'd watched destroy everything good about their community. Power, he said finally. Not money, though he's got plenty of that. Not respect, because nobody really respects him. Power over other people's lives. The ability to make people dance to his tune, whether they want to or not. Men like that never stop, Rosa said grimly. They always want more, and they'll destroy anything that stands in their way. Maybe. But they also make mistakes when they get overconfident, and Thornfield's got enemies besides me, people who've been waiting for someone to stand up to him. Cole moved away from the window and began building up the fire for evening. We might not be as alone as we think. As darkness settled over the ranch, they prepared their first real meal together. Rosa proved remarkably skilled at stretching their limited ingredients into something approaching a feast, while Emma contributed bread she'd baked using coals. Mother's recipe that she'd found written in careful script on a piece of paper tucked into the flour bin. They ate by candlelight, the warm glow transforming the simple cabin into something that felt almost festive despite their circumstances. Conversation flowed more easily than it had during their desperate flight from town, ranging from practical discussions about winter preparations to more personal revelations about their backgrounds and experiences. I always wanted to learn to read properly, Rosa admitted, as they cleared away the dishes. I know enough to get by, but I never had time for education. I could teach you, Emma offered. If you'd like, I mean. I was the only girl in my family who finished school. Cole looked up from banking the fire. Sarah left some school books in the chest upstairs, basic readers and arithmetic texts. You're welcome to use them. The conversation continued as they settled around the fireplace, each finding comfort in the simple domestic rhythms that had been missing from their lives for so long. Rosa shared stories of her travels through Mexico and the American territories, while Emma talked about her childhood in a small farming community and her dreams of someday having a home of her own. Cole found himself talking about Sarah more than he had since her death, sharing memories of their courtship and marriage, their plans for expanding the ranch and starting a family. For the first time, those memories brought more comfort than pain, as if having people to share them with had somehow lessened their weight. She sounds like she was an amazing woman, Emma said softly. She was, and she would have liked both of you. Cole stared into the fire, seeing shapes in the flames that reminded him of better times. Sarah always believed that people came into your life when you needed them most, even if you didn't realize it at the time. Rosa stretched her legs toward the fire, her expression thoughtful. Maybe she was right. God knows we all needed something to change in our lives. As the evening wound down and they prepared for sleep, Cole realized that something fundamental had shifted in the space of a single day. The desperate flight from Copper Falls had brought them together, but these quiet hours of shared domestic life had begun to forge bonds that went deeper than mere mutual convenience. They were no longer just three people hiding from a common enemy. They were becoming something more complex and durable. Emma's gentleness provided a counterbalance to Rosa's fierce independence, while Rosa's strength offered protection for Emma's vulnerability. Cole's knowledge of the land and his determination to protect them both gave their small group the foundation it needed to survive. As he settled onto his makeshift bed near the fireplace, listening to the quiet sounds of Rosa and Emma preparing for sleep in their respective rooms, Cole felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of a man facing inevitable defeat, but the quiet confidence that comes from being part of something larger than yourself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new fears. Thornfield's men might appear on the horizon, winter would continue its inexorable approach, and their resources would dwindle with each passing day. But tonight, for the first time since Sarah's death, Cole Bennett wasn't facing the future alone. Outside, the wind whispered through. The pine trees and coyotes called from the distant hills. Inside the cabin, three people who'd found each other in the darkest of circumstances settled into sleep, protected by walls that had sheltered the Bennett family for 3 generations, and warmed by the knowledge that sometimes, when the world seemed determined to destroy everything good and decent, ordinary people could still find ways to take care of each other. In the morning, they would begin the real work of survival. But for now, rest was enough, and hope was growing stronger with each passing hour. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks after their arrival at the ranch, delivered by a boy who couldn't have been more than 14. Cole was splitting firewood behind the cabin when he heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats, and he immediately grabbed his rifle before stepping into view. The rider was small and slight, hunched over the neck of a tired-looking mare, and he was pushing the animal harder than was wise on the rocky mountain trails. "Mr. Bennett!" the boy called out as he reined in his horse near the front porch. "Mr. Bennett, you gotta help us!" Cole recognized him now. Tommy Brewster, whose family ran a small homestead about 15 miles southeast of the ranch. The Brewsters were good people who'd always minded their own business and treated their neighbors fairly. Tommy's father had helped Cole repair his barn roof 2 summers ago, and his mother had brought food when Sarah was dying. "Tommy, what's wrong?" Cole asked, lowering his rifle but not setting it aside completely. Rosa and Emma emerged from the cabin, drawn by the commotion. Both women had learned to be wary of unexpected visitors, and Emma positioned herself slightly behind Rosa, ready to retreat inside if necessary. Over the past 3 weeks, they'd all developed the kind of vigilant awareness that comes from living under constant threat. Tommy dismounted with the awkward urgency of someone who'd been riding hard for hours. His clothes were dust-covered and sweat-stained, and his young face was tight with fear and exhaustion. "It's my pa," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Thornfield's men came to our place yesterday. They said we owed money for using their water, claimed our creek runs through mining property." Cole felt his stomach drop. The Brewster homestead was built around a natural spring that had been flowing for centuries before Magnus Thornfield ever set foot in the territory. If Thornfield was claiming water rights that far from his actual mining operations, it meant his appetite for expansion had grown beyond anything Cole had imagined. "How much did they say you owed?" Rosa asked, stepping forward with the practical directness that had become characteristic of her approach to problems. $500, Tommy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have 500 cents, let alone $500. Pa told them we'd been using that water since before Thornfield ever came to these parts, but they said that didn't matter. They gave us 1 week to pay, or they'd take our land and everything on it." Emma moved closer, her maternal instincts responding to the boy's obvious distress. "How many men were there?" 6, all armed. All wearing those black coats with the company badges. Their leader was a big man with scars on his hands and eyes like a snake. He kept smiling while he talked, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Cole knew the man Tommy was describing. Marcus Steele, Thornfield's chief enforcer and the architect of most of the legal land grabs that had expanded the mining company's territory over the past 2 years. Steele was smart, ruthless, and completely without conscience when it came to carrying out his employer's orders. If he was involved, the situation was even worse than Tommy's description suggested. "Where's your father now?" Cole asked. "He rode to town this morning trying to find someone who'd loan us the money, but everybody's too scared of Thornfield to help. Sheriff Garrett told Pa that water rights were a civil matter and he couldn't get involved." Tommy's hands clenched into fists as he spoke. "Pa sent me here because he said you were the only man in the territory who'd stood up to Thornfield and lived to tell about it. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on Cole. He'd stood up to Thornfield once, in a moment of moral clarity that had cost him everything he owned and committed him to a path that could only end in his destruction. Now other families were looking to him for leadership and protection he couldn't provide, expecting him to be a hero when he was barely managing to survive from day to day. Rosa caught his eye, and he could see her thinking through the implications of Tommy's request. They'd spent 3 weeks building a fragile sense of security at the ranch, establishing routines and relationships that had begun to feel sustainable despite their limited resources. Getting involved in the Brewster family's problems would shatter that security and draw Thornfield's attention back to them just when they'd started to hope they might be forgotten. But Emma was already moving toward the cabin, her decision apparently made. "Tommy, you look exhausted and half-starved. Come inside and let us feed you while we figure out what to do." The boy followed her gratefully, and Cole found himself walking behind them with Rosa, both of them exchanging worried glances, but neither willing to voice their concerns in front of their young visitor. Inside the cabin, Emma bustled around, preparing food, while Rosa quietly pumped water for Tommy to wash with. Cole sat across from the boy at the wooden table, studying his young face and seeing his own desperation reflected there. "Tell me exactly what Steele said," Cole instructed. "Every word you can remember." Tommy accepted a bowl of stew from Emma and began eating with the mechanical hunger of someone who'd been too worried to eat properly for days. Between bites, he recounted the conversation with Thornfield's men, and Cole found himself both impressed and terrified by the sophistication of their operation. Steele had arrived with carefully forged documents that purported to show Thornfield's mining company had filed claims on water rights throughout a 30-mile radius of their primary operations. The documents looked official, complete with territorial seals and legal language that would intimidate anyone without extensive knowledge of mining law. When Tommy's father had protested that their homestead predated Thornfield's arrival in the territory, Steele had simply smiled and explained that prior use didn't matter if it hadn't been properly documented with the territorial authorities. "He kept talking about regularizing the situation," Tommy said, his voice taking on a bitter edge that sounded wrong coming from someone so young. "Said Thornfield was willing to be reasonable and let us buy our water rights instead of just taking them. $500 was actually a bargain," he said, considering how much water we'd been stealing over the years. Rosa set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. "It's extortion, pure and simple. They're counting on families like yours not knowing enough about the law to fight back." "But the documents looked real," Tommy protested. "They had official seals." "And everything. Seals can be forged," Cole said grimly. "And even if they were real, there are ways to challenge water rights claims if you know what you're doing. The problem is that fighting them legally takes time and money that most folks don't have." Emma had been listening quietly while she cleaned up the kitchen, but now she spoke up with a question that cut to the heart of their dilemma. "How many other families do you think they've approached with these demands?" Tommy's answer confirmed Cole's worst fears. "At least 6 that I know of. The Hendersons got the same visit 2 days before us. The Pattersons and the McKinneys got theirs last week. Word is, they're working their way through every homestead and small ranch in the valley." Cole stood and walked to the window, his mind racing through the implications of what they were hearing. Thornfield wasn't just targeting individual families anymore. He was launching a coordinated campaign to drive out every independent landowner in the region. The scale of the operation suggested resources and planning that went far beyond simple greed. This was about establishing total control over the territory's water supplies, which would give him leverage over every mining operation, ranch and farm from here to the territorial capital. "It's brilliant in an evil sort of way," Rosa said, following Cole's line of thinking. "He's not trying to buy or steal the land directly. He's making it impossible for anyone to farm or ranch without paying him tribute for water rights. And once people start paying, Emma added with growing understanding, they'll never be able to stop. He'll just keep raising the rates until they're forced to sell out anyway. Tommy looked back and forth between them, confusion and desperation warring in his young features. So what do we do? Pa's counting on me to bring back help, but it sounds like there's nothing anyone can do. Cole turned away from the window, his decision crystallizing with the kind of clarity that comes when all your options are bad, but one is clearly less wrong than the others. There might be something, he said slowly, but it's dangerous and it would mean all of us taking risks we might not survive. Rosa raised an eyebrow. What kind of risks? The kind where we gather all the affected families together and make a stand against Thornfield as a group instead of letting him pick us off one by one. Cole began pacing, his thoughts organizing themselves as he spoke. If 6 families are being extorted, there are probably others who will be next. Together, we might have enough people to make Thornfield think twice about pushing forward with this scheme. Emma shook her head. You're talking about fighting the most powerful man in the territory. He has more guns, more money, and more political connections than all of us combined. Maybe. But he also has something to lose now. His operation depends on maintaining the illusion of legitimacy. If we can expose what he's doing in a way that draws attention from territorial authorities, we might be able to stop him. Tommy leaned forward eagerly. You mean like getting the newspapers involved? Or maybe appealing directly to the territorial governor? Something like that, Cole agreed, though privately he doubted that any territorial officials would be willing to challenge Thornfield's operation without overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing. But first we need to know exactly how many families are being targeted and what kind of evidence we can gather about the fraudulent nature of these water rights claims. Rosa stood and began clearing away the dishes, her movements sharp with barely contained energy. This is insane, she said without looking at any of them. We're talking about 3 people who are already hiding from Thornfield suddenly deciding to lead some kind of uprising against him. Do you have any idea what he'll do to us if this plan fails? I know exactly what he'll do, Cole replied quietly. The same thing he'll do if we hide here and do nothing while he destroys every decent family in the valley. The only difference is whether we go down fighting or go down cowering. Emma set down her dish rag and turned to face them all. What about the practical considerations? We don't have money to travel around gathering families together. We don't have weapons enough to fight armed men. We don't even have enough food to last the winter for ourselves, let alone support some kind of resistance movement. These were valid concerns, and Cole knew that Emma was being practical rather than cowardly. But as he looked at Tommy's desperate, young face, he found himself thinking about Sarah's belief that people came into your life when you needed them most. Maybe this boy's arrival wasn't just bad timing. Maybe it was an opportunity to do something meaningful with the time they had left. The Brewsters have a wagon, Cole said, thinking out loud, and if we can convince other families to join us, they'll have resources too. We're not talking about starting a war. We're talking about organizing people who are already being victimized and giving them a way to fight back legally. Rosa threw her dish rag into the sink with unnecessary force. And when Thornfield's men start shooting, what then? Are we going to fight back with pitchforks and moral outrage? If necessary, Cole said simply. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken fears and difficult truths. They all knew that opposing Thornfield directly would almost certainly mean their deaths, but they also knew that doing nothing would mean watching good families be destroyed one by one until there was nothing left of the community they'd all once been part of. Tommy broke the silence with a question that revealed wisdom beyond his years. Mr. Bennett, do you really think we can win? Cole met the boy's eyes and gave him the only honest answer he could. "I think we can make Thornfield pay a price for what he's doing. Whether that's winning or not depends on how you look at it." Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. Winter was coming fast, and with it the season when travel would become difficult and families would be most vulnerable to pressure from men like Steele. If they were going to act, it would have to be soon. Emma walked over to Cole and took his hand, her touch warm and steady. "If we do this," she said quietly, "we do it together, all of us." Rosa sighed and shook her head, but when she spoke, her voice carried the resigned determination of someone who'd made an impossible choice. "I must be as crazy as the rest of you, but I'm in too. Just promise me we'll have a plan that's more sophisticated than charging directly into Thornfield's guns." Cole squeezed Emma's hand and nodded to Rosa. "We'll have a plan, and Tommy, you can tell your father that he's not alone in this fight anymore." As they began discussing the practical details of organizing resistance against Magnus Thornfield's empire, none of them spoke about the very real possibility that they were planning their own destruction. But in the growing darkness outside the cabin windows, something larger than individual survival was beginning to take shape. The kind of desperate courage that sometimes emerges when ordinary people decide they'd rather die fighting than live in fear. The complications they'd hoped to avoid had found them anyway, but perhaps that had always been inevitable. Some fights choose you, regardless of whether you're ready for them, and the only real choice is how you respond when the moment arrives. For better or worse, their moment had come. The gathering took place in the abandoned church that Thornfield's men had burned the previous spring. What remained were blackened stone walls and a skeletal wooden frame that cast eerie shadows in the moonlight. Cole had chosen the location deliberately. It served as a stark reminder of what they were fighting against, while providing enough cover to hide their meeting from casual observation. 12 families had answered the call, more than Cole had dared hope for. The Brewsters arrived first, with Tommy's father Henry, looking like a man who'd aged years in the past week. The Henderson family brought their 3 adult sons, all of them armed and grim-faced. The Pattersons came with documentation they'd managed to gather about their own water rights, while the McKinneys brought news that 2 more families had received Thornfield's ultimatums just that morning. Emma and Rosa had spent the previous 3 days traveling between homesteads, carrying Cole's message and gathering information about the extent of Thornfield's operation. What they'd discovered was even worse than anyone had imagined. The mining company wasn't just targeting water rights, they were systematically documenting every resource in the valley, from timber stands to mineral deposits, preparing for a complete takeover of the region. "He's not just stealing our water," Henry Brewster explained to the assembled group. "He's mapping our land, cataloging our assets, and building legal justifications for taking everything we've built over the past 20 years. James Patterson, a weathered man who'd fought in the war before settling in the territory, studied the forged documents they'd collected from various families. "These seals look authentic, but the legal language is wrong. Territorial water law doesn't work the way these papers claim it does." "That doesn't matter if nobody challenges them," Rosa pointed out from her position near the church's broken altar. "Thornfield's counting on people being too scared or too ignorant to fight back through proper legal channels." Emma had been talking quietly with some of the women, gathering information about the family's resources and capabilities. "If we pool what we have," she reported, "there are enough weapons and ammunition to arm maybe half the men. We've got 3 wagons between us, enough horses for messengers, and about 2 weeks' worth of food if we're careful." Cole stood in what had once been the church's pulpit, looking out at faces that reflected his own mixture of determination and fear. These were good people who'd never asked for trouble, farmers and ranchers who just wanted to work their land and raise their families in peace. Now they were being forced to choose between submission and almost certain death. Before we go any further, Cole said, everyone needs to understand what we're risking. Thornfield has 40 armed men, political connections throughout the territory, and enough money to buy his way out of most legal troubles. If we oppose him directly, some of us won't survive the consequences. Old Mrs. McKinney, whose husband had died the previous winter, spoke up from the back of the group. My boys are talking about leaving the territory, taking what they can carry, and starting over somewhere else, but running away just means Thornfield wins without a fight. Running away means staying alive, her eldest son countered. There's other places to farm, other valleys where men like Thornfield haven't established control yet. The debate continued for nearly an hour, with families arguing among themselves about the wisdom of resistance versus retreat. Cole listened to their fears and concerns, understanding that each family was weighing their own survival against the broader principle of standing up to tyranny. Finally, Rosa stepped forward with a proposal that cut through the endless discussion. What if we don't fight Thornfield directly? She asked. What if we expose him instead? Explain, Henry Brewster demanded. These forged documents, the extortion demands, the systematic land grabbing. It's all evidence of criminal activity. If we can get this information to territorial authorities or newspaper editors in Denver, we might be able to bring outside pressure to bear on Thornfield's operation. Emma nodded enthusiastically. Rosa's right. Thornfield's power depends on operating in isolation without outside scrutiny. If we can make his crimes public knowledge, he'll have to answer to people beyond his immediate sphere of influence. James Patterson was already shaking his head. You think newspaper editors in Denver care about water rights disputes in a remote mining territory? And even if they did, how would we get the information to them without Thornfield's men intercepting? Our messengers. It was a valid concern, but Cole found himself building on Rosa's idea. What if we don't try to be subtle about it? What if we force a confrontation that's so public, so dramatic, that territorial authorities have to take notice? What kind of confrontation? Tommy Brewster asked, his young voice tight with excitement. Cole walked to the center of the ruined church, his plan crystallizing as he spoke. Thornfield's scheduled to arrive in Copper Falls tomorrow for his monthly inspection of the mining operations. He always travels with a small escort and makes a show of meeting with local business leaders. What if we were waiting for him with our evidence and our demands? The silence that followed was broken by nervous laughter from several of the men. You want us to confront Magnus Thornfield directly? Henry Brewster asked. In town, where he controls the sheriff and half the businesses. I want us to make it impossible for him to ignore what he's doing to our families, Cole replied. If we present our evidence publicly with witnesses, he can't simply make us disappear the way he would if we opposed him quietly. Emma stepped closer to Cole, her voice carrying both support and concern. It's incredibly dangerous. If things go wrong, we'll all be trapped in town with nowhere to run. If things go wrong anyway, we'll at least go down fighting instead of being picked off one family at a time, Rosa added grimly. The debate resumed with new intensity as families considered this bold and potentially suicidal plan. Some argued for a more cautious approach. Others insisted that direct confrontation was the only way to break Thornfield's stranglehold on the region. Cole found himself thinking about Sarah's belief in standing up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. When the vote was finally taken, 8 families agreed to participate in the confrontation, while 4 decided to take their chances. With fleeing the territory, it wasn't unanimous support, but it was enough to move forward with a plan that would either expose Thornfield's crimes or result in their own destruction. They spent the rest of the night organizing their evidence, planning their approach, and saying what might be their final goodbyes to loved ones. Emma and Rosa worked together to create multiple copies of the most damaging documents, while the men cleaned weapons and discussed tactics for the coming confrontation. As dawn broke over the burned church, Cole looked around at the faces of people who'd chosen to risk everything for the principle that some things were worth fighting for. They weren't soldiers or heroes. They were ordinary people who'd been pushed too far and had decided to push back. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or destruction, but tonight they'd reclaimed something that Thornfield's intimidation had almost stolen from them, the courage to stand together against injustice, regardless of the cost. In the growing light of morning, 37 people prepared to challenge the most powerful man in the territory, knowing that their only weapons were truth, determination, and the desperate hope that sometimes right could triumph over might. The final confrontation was coming, and none of them would emerge unchanged from what was about to unfold in the streets of Copper Falls. The confrontation in Copper Falls had lasted exactly 17 minutes, but those 17 minutes changed everything. Magnus Thornfield arrived in town with his usual entourage of armed men and political cronies, expecting another routine inspection of his expanding empire. Instead, he found 37 angry families waiting for him in the town square, with documented evidence of his crimes spread across tables for everyone to see. What followed wasn't the violent shootout that many had expected, but something far more devastating to a man like Thornfield: public humiliation. When faced with irrefutable proof of forged documents, illegal land seizures, and systematic extortion, even his own supporters began to distance themselves. The territorial marshal, who happened to be visiting Copper Falls on unrelated business, found himself compelled to investigate the allegations despite whatever arrangements he might have had with the mining company. Thornfield's response had been predictably vicious. He'd ordered his men to arrest the troublemakers for trespassing and disturbing the peace, but Sheriff Garrett had surprised everyone by refusing to comply. The sheriff, it turned out, had been keeping his own documentation of Thornfield's activities, waiting for the right moment to act. With public opinion turning against the mining company and territorial authorities now involved, that moment had finally arrived. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and merciless. Federal investigators arrived within a week, armed with warrants and the kind of authority that even Thornfield's political connections couldn't overcome. The mining company's fraudulent claims were exposed. Their forged documents were traced back to a corrupt territorial clerk, and Marcus Steele was arrested for extortion and conspiracy. Thornfield himself managed to avoid immediate imprisonment by fleeing to Mexico, but his empire crumbled overnight as investors withdrew their support and federal authorities seized his assets. Now, 6 months later, Cole Bennett stood on the porch of his cabin watching Rosa tend the garden she'd planted in the spring. The vegetables were thriving in the rich soil, and the sight of green growth where there had once been only stubble and weeds felt like a miracle he was still learning to believe in. The ranch that had been hours away from foreclosure was now legally his again, the bank having been forced to return the deed when Thornfield's illegal manipulation of local finances was exposed. Emma emerged from the cabin, carrying a basket of freshly baked bread, her movements confident and graceful in a way that spoke of someone who'd finally found a place where she belonged. Over the winter months, she'd blossomed from a frightened victim into a woman of quiet strength and surprising determination. The trauma of her past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined her every waking moment. The Henderson boys finished repairing the barn roof this morning, Emma reported, setting the basket on the porch table. And Mrs. Patterson brought over some seeds for next year's planting. She says her tomatoes did so well this season that she wants to expand her garden. Cole smiled at the mention of their neighbours. The families who'd stood together against Thornfield had formed bonds that went deeper than mere shared experience. They'd become a genuine community, helping each other with harvests, sharing resources during difficult times, and celebrating successes together. Tommy Brewster was now apprenticed to the territorial surveyor, learning skills that would help him reclaim and properly document his family's water rights. The McKinney boys had decided to stay in the territory after all, and were planning to expand their ranch now that they no longer faced constant threats to their livelihood. Rosa looked up from her weeding, her face tanned from working in the sun and her dark hair gleaming with health. "The territorial governor's planning to visit next month," she said. "He wants to use our valley as an example of how communities can resist corporate exploitation through legal means." "Politicians," Cole muttered, but without real malice. "They always want to take credit for other people's courage." Emma laughed, a sound that had become one of Cole's favorite things about their shared life. "Let him take credit if it helps. Other communities facing similar problems. What matters is that it worked. What had worked was more than just their resistance to Thornfield's schemes. Over the winter months, the three of them had developed a domestic arrangement that none of them had planned, but all had come to cherish. Emma had become the heart of their household, bringing warmth and organization to spaces that had been purely functional. Rosa had taken charge of their agricultural operations, applying knowledge gained from years of traveling to create the most productive farm in the valley. Cole provided stability and protection, but also found himself learning new ways of thinking about family and responsibility. They weren't married in any legal sense, and their relationship defied conventional social categories. Emma and Rosa shared the main bedroom, their friendship having deepened into something that brought them both comfort and strength. Cole had built himself a small addition to the cabin, giving everyone privacy while maintaining the close connection that had sustained them through the worst times. It was an unconventional arrangement, but it worked for them in ways that conventional arrangements never could have. "There's something else," Rosa said, standing up and brushing dirt from her. "Hence, Tommy Brewster brought news from town this morning. The territorial legislature is planning to pass new laws protecting homesteaders' water rights. They're calling it the Copper Falls Act." Cole felt a surge of satisfaction that surprised him with its intensity. Sarah had always believed that individual actions could create changes that rippled outward in ways you couldn't predict or control. Their stand against Thornfield had apparently inspired similar resistance in other parts of the territory, leading to legal reforms that would protect future generations of farmers and ranchers. Emma moved closer to Cole, her hand finding his, with the casual intimacy that had developed between them over months of shared labor and mutual support. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Everything we went through, I mean." Cole considered the question seriously. The past year had brought more danger, uncertainty, and upheaval than he'd experienced in his entire previous life. He'd lost everything he thought he owned, nearly died multiple times, and been forced to rebuild his understanding of what constituted a meaningful existence. But as he looked around at the thriving garden, the repaired buildings, and the two remarkable women who'd become his family, he couldn't honestly say he'd trade any of it for the safety of his former isolation. "No regrets," he said finally. "Sarah used to say that life wasn't about avoiding storms, but about learning to dance in the rain. I think she'd approve of the dance we've learned." Rosa joined them on the porch, settling into the chair Cole had built for her the previous month. "I've been thinking about the future," she said, "about what we want to accomplish here beyond just surviving." This had become a regular topic of conversation, as their immediate crisis had given way to the luxury of long-term planning. Cole's ranch was producing more food than the three of them could consume, and Rosa's innovations in crop rotation and soil management were attracting attention from other farmers throughout the region. Emma had started teaching children from neighboring families, using the school books Sarah had left behind and discovering a talent for education that none of them had suspected. The territorial education supervisor wants Emma to become the official teacher for the entire valley, Cole said. They're talking about building a proper schoolhouse next spring. Emma's face lit up with excitement. Can you imagine? A real school, with proper desks and blackboards and shelves full of books. I could teach children to read and write and think for themselves. Knowledge is the best protection against men like Thornfield, Rosa added. Educated people are harder. To fool with forged documents and false claims, Cole nodded, thinking about the role education had played in their own successful resistance. Emma's ability to read legal documents carefully had been crucial in identifying the flaws in Thornfield's fraudulent claims. Rosa's mathematical skills had helped them organize their resources efficiently during the winter months. His own knowledge of local geography and history had provided the foundation for their defensive strategies. As the afternoon sun slanted across the valley, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, the three of them sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, Cole had been a broken man, facing inevitable defeat. Emma had been a victim with no control over her fate, and Rosa had been a refugee with no permanent home. Now they were successful farmers, respected community leaders, and pioneers, in a new model of family structure that prioritized mutual support over traditional hierarchies. "There's one more thing," Emma said eventually, her voice carrying a note of nervous excitement. "I've been corresponding with other women who've faced situations similar to ours. Women who've escaped from various forms of exploitation and are trying to rebuild their lives." Rosa turned to look at her friend with sudden interest. "What kind of correspondence?" "The kind where we share information about safe places, legal resources, and people who can be trusted to help. The kind where we warn each other about dangerous situations and dangerous men." Emma pulled a letter from her apron pocket. "This came yesterday. It's from a group of women in Colorado who want to visit us, to see how we've managed to create a stable life together." Cole felt a mixture of pride and apprehension at the thought of their unconventional household becoming a model for others. "You want to turn our ranch into some kind of refuge?" "Not exactly a refuge," Emma clarified. "More like a place where people can learn new ways of living, new ways of organizing families and communities that don't depend on traditional power structures." Rosa was nodding enthusiastically. "We've proven that people can support each other without marriage, without male dominance, without sacrificing individual autonomy for collective security. That's valuable knowledge." As they discussed the possibilities and challenges of expanding their mission, Cole found himself thinking about the strange paths that had led them to this point. A desperate gamble to save two strangers had evolved into something larger and more meaningful than he could have imagined. They'd created not just a successful farm, but a new model for human relationships based on equality, mutual respect, and shared responsibility. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that reflected off the windows of their cabin like captured fire. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its ancient song to the emerging stars, and the wind carried the scent of Rosa's herbs and Emma's baking bread. Cole Bennett, who'd thought his story was ending when he spent his last $23 on two desperate women, realized that he'd actually been beginning the most important chapter of his life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. There would be letters to answer, visitors to welcome, crops to tend, and children to teach. But tonight, as three people who'd found each other in the darkest of circumstances settled into the rhythm of their chosen family, the future felt full of possibilities that none of them could have imagined when their journey first began. In the growing darkness, they carried their dishes inside and began preparing for another evening of shared stories, quiet companionship, and the deep satisfaction that comes from building something beautiful out of materials that others had discarded as worthless. Outside, the land they'd fought to protect spread out beneath a canopy of stars, promising harvests yet to come and dreams yet to be fulfilled. Their story had become part of the larger story of the American frontier, but it was also something entirely new, proof that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with grand gestures or political movements, but with ordinary people deciding to treat each other with kindness, respect, and the kind of love that creates families from strangers and hope from desperation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.